Okay, wonderful. I am Scott Lichman. I'm a board member with Impact Capital Forum, and we welcome you all today to the latest of our webinars, Impact Investing with the Refugee-Lens, the Path Forward. I'll be telling you more about that and our esteemed speakers in a few minutes, but first, Impact Capital Forum, for those of you who are new to our calls, is a platform for education, collaboration, and thought leadership in the impact investing and social entrepreneurship space. We are known for our in-person events and these days for the webinars, as well as other collaborative programs like working groups we put together. We have a range of topics we cover. Just recent webinars include impact investing in Africa, microfinancing in New York City, financial literacy in the 2020s, and net zero water emissions as part of a sustainability activity that we're involved in as well. We are, in terms of logistics for this event, it's being recorded. You should see at the bottom of your screens for the audience a Q&A bar, and we welcome you to supply questions there. Generally about halfway through the hour, we will open up the floor and take those questions directly to the speakers, so you can pipe them in early if you wish. There's also a chat bar if you have some logistical questions. And when we finish the webinar proper, which is the 4 speakers, and about 45 minutes to an hour of time, we invite everyone on this call to join breakout sessions. So these are, we have found popular small groups, meaning 3 or 4 people, usually involving one of the speakers in each group, to just talk about what projects they're working on, what additional questions they have, maybe brainstorm some partnership work has come out of previous breakouts. To do the breakout, just because of the way that Zoom works, we need to end the webinar, which is a one-way call, and start a group meeting. So you have in your invite the breakout session login ID, and just before the end of this call, I'll put it back in the chat so you can write it down. So with that, I'm about to turn it over to Diana D. Castro, who is an advisor and board member in the impact investing and social entrepreneurship space. She is a senior advisor for Mujer and previously was their COO. She's also on the Gender Smart subcommittee of the ELU Women's Empowerment Fund. And previously, she was an international private banker with RBC and Barclays. And she will, oh, did we lose her? Okay, we had Diana just a moment ago. I think I will go offline and bring her back. But in the meantime, I would love for Emma and John and Yanki to introduce themselves. Please go ahead. Emma, feel free.
Okay. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here, and we're really excited to be chatting about this topic, refugee-lens investing. I'm Director of Risk at Kiva, and for many of you, or those of you who don't know, Kiva.org is a crowdfunding platform. We make investments in microfinance institutions globally and other types of institutions to promote access to finance and financial inclusion. My background is in the microfinance and impact investing space. Prior to Kiva, I worked at Microvest, also heading up their risk and kind of portfolio monitoring function. I also was at Chatham Financial. It's a risk management advisor. There I focused on currency risk and hedging of emerging and frontier markets currencies for microfinance investment funds. So yeah, very excited to be here.
John, please go ahead.
Sure. Also looks like Diana has joined again. She's back. Well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those who are further east. My name is John Kluge. I'm the founder and one of the managing directors of the Refugee Investment Network. We are a nonprofit specialized intermediary focusing on refugee and migration lens investing, which I'm excited to talk to you all more about later today. But we work with a number of different stakeholders, from investors who are sometimes family offices, institutional investors, public investors as well, like the development finance institutions, and different kinds of entrepreneurs, and as well as foundations. My background has mostly been at the intersection of investing within the private sector and public policy.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Impact Capital Forum for organizing this webinar, and a real pleasure to be on this panel with Emma and John, to discuss this really important topic. And I'm hoping that Diana can join us. Otherwise, we just have to go ahead. I think she is maybe on the Zoom. So a little bit about me. There was a very general description of who and how you want all of us identify as who the definitions we have for refugees. I'm a former refugee, or I should say a refugee. I guess you always stay as part of you always stays as a refugee. My parents left Tibet in the late 50s, and we settled in India, and I've lived in India and Nepal, and I came here in '86. I was really fortunate because in those days it was very easy to get a good free education here in the United States. So I got to go to Columbia University, graduate school, and it's been my pleasure to be, right from the beginning, leading the CDFI that I'm going to tell you a little bit about, that has done some incredible work with immigrants also, but also especially with refugees. We've made over 32 million in loans, 7 million plus to refugees, and helped refugees invest over 27 million from savings and match, and additional loans in home ownership, further education, recertification. And I also have a few members of our refugee team on the Zoom, and our board chair, Kwame Mafo. So very pleased to be here.
A good question to start with is defining refugee investing, since the potential applications of investment dollars are so broad. And I wondered if each of you could provide a little bit of perspective on what's included. For me, as I think about it, as a layperson, there's sort of the marginalization phase of refugees, where in country they are not being treated appropriately. There's a diaspora type phase where they've been moved to camps perhaps, and then there's a resettlement phase, either back in their home country or further. What else, how else do you bucket this? And allow me to just hold for a minute. I think, Diana, I think you're still in under attendees. If you check your email, you should be able to come back under speakers, and I will be in contact with you on the outside while John and the others talk about a definition of refugee-lens investing.
Oh, she's back. Before we jump in on to answer your question, Scott, maybe Diana, if you'd like to give an overview of some of the challenges facing displaced communities around the world, so we have a quick level set. I think your mic needs to be turned on. No? All right, well, I'm happy to jump in. In the meantime, I think it's good for us all to have kind of a common understanding at a sort of a baseline. So today we look around the world, and despite COVID occupying much of the headlines, global forced migration is a global phenomenon. And this is something that is persisting well beyond the Syrian and Venezuelan crises, which are of course the most current things occupying the media and the largest displacements that we're seeing today. But in some, we're looking at over 80 million people worldwide who are displaced around the world, including refugees who have crossed international borders after fleeing violence, oppression, and conflict, as well as internally displaced people who are displaced within their own borders. We include this growing number of people just so you understand the scale. And if you start factoring in other concerns like climate, extreme weather, and drought, we're looking at potentially, depending on how we as a global community choose to respond to displacement, are looking at potentially between 150 to 300 million people displaced worldwide by 2030. For the Refugee Investment Network, we take a very broad definition of refugee-lens investing. So we certainly include the formal and legal definition of someone who classifies and qualifies as a refugee, who is afforded particular rights and statuses and protections, but also those who are displaced internally, those who've been displaced due to climate, who currently do not have any sort of official protection or status, asylum seekers, stateless people, indigenous communities here in the United States, First Nations, sort of the original displaced, forcibly displaced people, as well as the communities that host them. And that's an important thing, which we'll come back to a little bit later. So that's in terms of the demographics. We also think about the journey of migration. So many of us consider, think about refugees or connect with refugees through things that we're reading about, particularly those of us in the global north. But there are displaced people all over the world in our communities, and many of us don't even understand that background and context. From an investor's perspective, the investment interventions that can dramatically improve outcomes for displaced people are those that target root causes of displacement. So we think about sort of that state of fragility prior to displacement. We think about the emergency context, so investments that improve humanitarian response capacity as well as innovation. And then we look at sort of post-conflict, which is really looking at economic inclusion and economic integration. And one of the sort of major focus areas that we look at the RIN is what we call the social determinants of work. So the fundamentals that allow someone to be an active participant in a formal economy. You need access to affordable and safe quality housing. You need access to safe and secure financial services and banking. You need access to transportation, education, childcare, and health. If you don't have those things, it's very difficult to become an active participant in a formal economy. And of course, rights and identity go along with those things. So that's sort of the demographics of definition and the different phases of displacement that we look at for interventions. Yanki or Emma, do you want to add anything?
So I'm glad you were first, John. I think you did an amazing job. And I agree with your definition, but something that I pointed out when we were preparing for this call is Business Center for New Americans, that's the CDFI I represent. We're one of 21 microfinance organizations and CDFIs in the country who work with refugees and have a special program for financial inclusion for refugees. And we're funded by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, so we really do rely a lot on government funding, but that's something BCNA is, sort of trying to move away from. So if you speak to a CDFI or a microfinance organization working with refugees, their definition is very limited. Again, I agree with everything that John has said. We follow the definition and we serve, under those programs, we serve refugees who are certified by the government as a refugee. It could be a refugee, asylee, someone who's come here trying to escape persecution or civil unrest and then gets approved for asylum status. But having said that, BCNA, we think it's extremely important, to invest in people. We feel people are the most important assets. When people talk about assets, they think of money, they think of a house. We agree with Professor Hunis, who says, most important asset are people. So we have, thanks to, with the help of our board members, we've raised additional funds to also serve the other clients who don't fall under the refugee category. So having said that, I know when I speak to many peer and fellow CDFIs, for them, the idea of working with refugees is a little confusing because for them, they're all immigrants. So in the US, there's not as much awareness until recently that we did have this other category of foreign-born who are refugees. And I think it's a good thing that, given the crisis we're in, it's actually shining a light on the needs of refugees and, that we do need to think bigger and we need to be more innovative and figure out how to work with them.
Yeah, and just to jump in on the Kiva side and very much agree with what John and Yanki have said. So at Kiva, we work through local partners who are on the ground. So we call them our field partners. There are the financial service providers. So we also look at a broad definition of refugees, but we're really relying on those local organizations, those partners to define who the refugees are, given the local context, given how they're working. But in general, we take a broad definition. And so some of the refugees that we've worked with over the years through those partner institutions, some have been officially recognized as refugees, some haven't, some are urban, some might be in camps. It could include a range of types of people, including, you know, IDPs, forcibly displaced and deportees. I guess looking at kind of how on the Kiva side, we look at refugee lens investing, we also take a broad approach and are looking at it from the perspective of investing in refugees and IDPs, also looking at forced migration prevention in some places, and also how to provide some support for impacted host communities. So we're kind of looking at it, those are our three targeted populations as we look at refugee lens investing.
So can I jump in now? Can you hear me?
Hello. Yeah.
Hi, so sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm so excited to be here and have this opportunity to talk about such a pressing matter. So I think did everyone have a chance to speak about the definition, starting with the definition, not only of refugees, but what is refugee and migration lens investing? Perfect, perfect. So I would share with us a little bit about how you define, or what are the criteria or the lenses that you use to identify refugee finance opportunities. And maybe if I can just for a moment, and Scott, perhaps you shared this in the beginning, but for the audience, I think it's important, because refugee finance is such a broad topic, that the focus of today's conversation is really more about the opportunities for investment in refugee and migration finance versus the other funding opportunities that are more related to humanitarian crisis interventions. So, so I just wanted to couch that this is a much broader topic and we could cover so much more, but this is the focus for this conversation. So if you could all share with us a little bit how you're defining that, what is the criteria and what are the lenses that you're looking for, that would be great. John, do you want to start?
I'm happy to. Thanks, Diana. And I put a link in the chat box for everyone, which can port you to the Refugee-Lens version 1.0. So this is a lens that is really a sort of a starting point framework that different kinds of investors and capital partners can use, as well as entrepreneurs who are seeking capitalization, to source, qualify, and provide some structure around their pipeline and potential investment opportunities. This is not so dissimilar to gender lens investing, in that it is about having an intentional practice of seeking out opportunities and supporting their growth and flourishing. In this context, we have worked with a 36-person expert group. We did this about 2.5 years ago now, when the RIN was just getting off of the ground. RIN, by the way, is the Refugee Investment Network. And the idea was to get insight and input from humanitarians, from investors across the capital continuum, from displaced people working with us as advisors and on our team, and policy and government professionals as well, to provide sort of a baseline for people to get started. What actually is a refugee lens deal? What does it look like? And so we have 6 different categories in this lens. We are iterating on this and adding sort of a version 2.0 in this new year. But these categories allow you to sort of, look at the world with an intentional way to see. This is particularly important because it can filter into how you conduct your diligence, the questions that you ask of potential investees, how you design your portfolio, and it can give you an opportunity to set really important benchmarks to advance equity through your investing, which is really what this is all about. Many refugees, the majority of refugees come from the global south, not all. Half of them are women, over half of them are children, and many, because they're coming from the global south, are also people of color. And this is sort of, as entrepreneurs, displaced people are often facing what Ross Baird, of formerly of Village Capital, now Blueprint, would call the three-strike rule when seeking capital and dealing with bias. One, you might be a person of color. Two, you're likely to be a woman. And three, you're coming from this displaced background. And so that's a really tough thing to work on, even when you have the constitutional right to work and full sort of status as a citizen or are on your pathway to citizenship. So we use this lens to help with sourcing and to help with qualifying. There is, of course, a risk, like in any kind of intentional impact investing, for a kind of refugee washing or a greenwashing kind of thing. And that's why this lens was important, that we could have a baseline. So it's not the case that you would be investing in a publicly traded company that is run by a single refugee. That would not qualify for us as a refugee lens deal, because there's no articulated impact thesis to support displaced people. Uber would be an example, which now has an executive who comes from a displaced background, but has not embedded any kind of focus supporting displaced diaspora, either through labor integration practices or through positively using their products and services to support these communities. There are plenty of deals in developed market as there are in developing markets, and that's another important thing to consider. But this lens is really the starting point, and includes both private equity opportunities, funds of funds, lending instruments and opportunities, as well as things like infrastructure that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. Yanki, how about you?
So obviously, our role is slightly different from, what John's organization has. We're an investee. We also invest in our clients. So all our clients, whether they're refugee, we have a program for refugees, which is great. You always need that extra funding. But we also, even if they don't fall within the criteria for the refugee program, we're able to, help them with either, access to credit. We lend up to $250,000, but most of the refugees who are coming to us are coming for the smaller micro loans. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the investors, who's invested in us. So when we first started, we started with a grant of $15,000 from American Express. And we started in response to the needs of, former refugees coming from the former Soviet Union, much older refugees who couldn't find employment. And we really used them to test the system and see if there could be, like a microfinance type of service in New York City. So, as we went along, we became more familiar with government funding. And I know people tend to try and stay away from government funding, but it's really worked well to our benefit. I would say most of the 32 million we've, I would say 65% of the 32 million we've lent out has been loans from the Small Business Administration. Again, if people are looking to grow their program, it's a great resource. Right now, the interest is zero, and you also get a very generous, what they call a technical assistance grant with it. We've also benefited from the CDFI fund at the Department of Treasury 9 years in a row. It's very competitive, but because of who we serve and the fact that we're making loans to clients who nobody else is able to, we score really high, and we've been very successful at getting awards from them 9 years in a row. So having said that, and Kwame, I know our board chair is, listening in, last few years, we've been trying to get non-government investments. And so far we've had a number of banks like BNB, Wells Fargo, HSBC, and there are a few who were actually really warming up to the idea, but then COVID struck, so they're taking a pause, and we completely understand. And we had a number of religious organizations like the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart. When they heard that we were processing PPP loans, they made an extremely low-cost investment in the Episcopal Diocese of New York. So the other resource that I find very exciting and we're looking into is C-Note. I don't know if people are familiar with them. I'm sure Emma is, and maybe John probably knows, people who founded it. They're two women, and it's an impact investment platform, and anyone, even with a small investment of a few $100s, you can actually participate. So, they're looking to invest in us, so we're extremely excited.
Fantastic. Emma, how about you for the fund? How are you defining the lenses and the criteria?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So we, as I mentioned before, we make loans through like local financial service providers. So we're generally looking at countries that have large refugee populations or financial service providers that are either microfinance institutions that are working with refugees or are looking to work with refugees. Those loans are, lent in the form of, so the loans we make to the financial institution are then on lent to refugee borrowers. They could be on lent as group loans, so like a group typical kind of microfinance structure. They could be lent as individual loans. And we're working across, we've been lending through Kiva.org since 2016. We've lent about close to $20 million through the crowdfunding platform to over 20,000 refugees, and it's across kind of globally, across more than 10 countries. The focus has been sort of the Middle East and Latin America, so places like Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, although obviously they're going through a very tough time now. Places in Central America like El Salvador, Honduras, different places, Colombia, is an important market given Venezuelan refugees there. And there's a handful of other countries as well in sub-Saharan Africa. So Kiva's role in the Refugee-Lens space has evolved, and we see it continuing to evolve. So while we see that, obviously addressing humanitarian assistance is super important, we also saw, as we've been talking about, that kind of longer term solutions are extremely important. And so that's where we thought we can play a role, since our mission is to provide access to finance, so increase economic opportunity. So what we wanted to do was use Kiva.org, which is a kind of unique risk tolerant crowdfunding platform to pilot refugee lending. So that's what we started doing about 4 years ago. We really wanted to show, there had been a lot of hesitation among financial service providers to lend to refugees. And what we were hearing from a lot of different microfinance institutions we were working with was that they were worried about the high risk of refugees, that they would, they would take a loan and then they would flee, for example, leave and not repay the loan. So through the pilot program we had on Kiva.org, we showed that the repayment risk is actually very similar to the risk of the rest of Kiva.org portfolio, indicating that refugee lending is not riskier. So this was a very important finding. And where we're looking to evolve also is through our new impact investing arm of Kiva, which is, the idea there is to be able to scale. So that we call that Kiva Capital. It's an impact first fund manager. So basically using Kiva.org kind of pilot, and we continue to lend to refugees through Kiva.org, but we're looking to also scale and kind of increase what we're doing through Kiva Capital. And what we're doing there is launching the Kiva Refugee Investment Fund, which I can talk more about later.
Fantastic. What rich experiences, and super interesting to hear about how either philanthropic or more concessionary capital has been an important catalyst to help jumpstart and attract private sector capital and begin to prove out refugee finance as a more traditional impact investment. What are your thoughts on, on where refugee finance is on the spectrum of impact investments, you know, from impact or concessional capital to finance first. Tell us more about how you see refugee finance today versus where it could be tomorrow. John, you want to share? You take that
Happy
one?
to jump in there. I think the most important thing to take away from this question is that there is a deal for every kind of capital. So if you think that your return expectations are too high to adopt a refugee lens, or you're not interested in developing markets, those are not excuses to not become a refugee lens practitioner. There really is an opportunity in this space. The field is certainly nascent, and I'll talk a little bit about its status a little bit later in our conversation, but there is a mix. So there's everything here from you know, market or above market rate returns in traditional investment avenues from a private equity or debt perspective in, let's say, real estate and affordable housing. There's a really exciting company based in Louisville, Kentucky, for example, called Launch International, Launch Capital Partners. And they're targeting a 19% rate of return by expanding the pool of affordable housing to resettled refugee communities and underserved communities in Kentucky. And now they're expanding to other parts of the country. I think, you know, that's, you know, what they're doing is innovative from the perspective of taking a business model that is working for underserved communities and applying it to a new demographic. But outside of that context, it's a pretty traditional affordable housing investment opportunity. So I think the inclusion, though, of displaced people as their clientele actually is reducing the risk for rent deferrals or late payments. And I think that's one of the interesting things that you'll find across other deals in the sector, is that the inclusion of displaced people, whether they're refugees or otherwise, actually is improving the bottom line for the investor or the company that's working on it. You also have a broad spectrum of sort of at market or just below market and concessional rate of returns that goes anywhere from 7% down to 2%. The International Rescue Committee, for example, operates a CDFI based in Baltimore called the Center for Economic Opportunity. They provide loans both on the business side as well as consumer loans to resettled refugees, as well as American citizens who wouldn't otherwise qualify for something like an SBA loan. Many people don't have good enough credit, or they're lacking assets, or they're lacking access to a guarantor, and are often disqualified from the financial resources that they need to grow and thrive. The IRC CEO is providing loans both to displaced people and local citizens, and is offering investors a 2% rate of return on their capital based, using their balance sheet as leverage. So it is a broad spectrum. There are opportunities, and I would say needs in some cases, for blended capital approaches, and also for foundations to be using both their PRI return-seeking capital as well as their grants, either to incentivize or de-risk things, whether that's providing guarantees or just improving opportunities for the rest of the capital stack, and acting as an incentive where markets are a little bit less tested, unproven, or unknown to investors. One thing that we have found is that as a sort of a new intentional practice space for investors, capital is willing to make one new adjustment, but typically not two or three. And what I mean by that is they're willing to go into a new thematic like refugee lens investing, but not necessarily change the geography of their investments, or not necessarily change the sectors of their focus, whether that be energy, housing, or whatever. And so that's where figuring out what is already within your portfolio that is close to this, that could be perhaps expanded or lean into a refugee context, is probably the first type of deal that we would advise or recommend investors to consider. And by the way, the RIN is not we are not a registered investment advisor. or a dealer broker. We're a nonprofit, but we do advising on the impact side of things, just context.
Fantastic. Yanki, tell us.
So, you know, obviously we're an investee, but one thing that Emma reminded me about is, you know, as I mentioned, we're part of one of 21 network of 21 organizations doing this work. So we've had at any given point, 21 organizations, different organizations throughout the US for the past, I think 25 years, working with refugees. But it's been very quiet and very subdued because these programs have been within large, huge, quite bureaucratic refugee resettlement organizations. But if you look at the data, they've performed really well. And one thing I'm trying to do is actually find a way to get hold of this data. And I think we're going to be allowed to use it and maybe publish a report. Because what I'm seeing a lot of is when people talk, they don't talk just about refugees, they automatically include refugees with immigrants when they talk about entrepreneurship. So I think we really need that separation so people are more aware that, oh, this data is specific to refugees. It's a good investment to invest in refugees who are coming to the US, being resettled. And the hope is by publishing this data, not only is there more investment in refugee entrepreneurship, but also it, you know, and I guess a lot will depend on, you know, who's in office, you know, come next year, but hopefully it'll influence policies so we get more, you know, refugees to be able to come to the US. So the other thing I wanted to say is in the last 2 years, I've been to several conferences. And actually when I was at the conference in London last year, I met a few of John's staff. And that's when I found out about RIN. So I'm really embarrassed to say, it's like, I felt like it was a wake-up call. I was like, oh my God, something like this exists in the US. And then the year before, I was invited to be at a conference where, you know, this was at UNCTAD, and they published this really, really detailed report on refugee entrepreneurship. And people asked me a lot of questions, you know, and once they knew that I wasn't from the CIA or FBI, they were like, oh, okay. So tell us a little bit more about, you know, the microenterprise development network in the US and what sort of support you get. And actually they were very surprised and delighted that it's a very mature and well-developed network. It's just that it doesn't get the exposure it needs. So, yeah.
So I'm just taking a look on time. I'd love for Emma, for you to share a little bit about where the fund stands in terms of the spectrum. And also give a heads up to our audience that I would like to ask one more question after this before we break to the Q&A. But for the audience to start thinking already about what questions you may have, feel free to send them in the chat, and that way we can we'll be ready to go when we're done with this session. But Emma, please.
Sure, yeah. So I agree with you know, what we've been talking about here, that there's really kind of a role for lots of different types of capital. It's definitely on a spectrum. So just to kind of fit Kiva in that context. So Kiva.org, the kind of crowdfunding platform that we've been running for about 15 years, that's been very risk tolerant capital. So that's like individual lenders, you and me, going on lending as little as $25 and lending, you know, to refugee borrowers. So those loans are made at basically 0%. So the goal there is that there be return of capital so that then the lending can continue. So that's been important. Kiva Refugee Investment Fund, the goal there is to really scale. So instead of you know, basically bringing in institutional capital, making term loans to these institutions, enabling them to grow their programs, enabling us to work with more institutions, and basically kind of normalizing working with refugees in some senses. Kiva Refugee Investment Fund, we're also looking for return of capital with a small target return, with the idea that basically we'll be building through the fund a diversified portfolio across multiple countries, managing it in very similar ways to other microfinance investment vehicles or MIVs. So the exposure there is really let's say exposure to microfinance, to financial institutions in emerging markets, and just, you know, emerging market risk. But the historical repayment rates for those MIVs, microfinance investment vehicles, has been quite good, despite the kind of the perception also of those that they're high risk. So yes, we fit there. And still an impact first manager, but Kiva Capital is targeting a small return.
Fantastic. So the last question, I've been hearing so many inspiring stories about entrepreneurs that not only address, you know, key multiple SDGs, but are also addressing root causes of displacement or improving the response, humanitarian response, or in post-crisis when migrants are being resettled, helping with the inclusion and integration. So, John, I'm going to ask you if you have one story that you can share with us that sheds light on the impact. That would be super helpful. And then I'm going to ask you also to kick off your answer to the last question, which is a call to action. Each one of you, please share what are your needs right now. Help the audience engage and also get us set up for the breakout sessions on what is being done by others and what can be done and how we could potentially partner.
Thank you so much, Diana. There are many, many, many stories. So if any of the participants or audience members are interested in discovering more about many of the refugee entrepreneurs out there, or the entrepreneurs serving and supporting displaced people with their products and services, we have incredible stories that we'd be happy to share with you. You know, one of them comes to mind because I'm sitting in our office or co-working environment here in Charlottesville, Virginia. Most of our team is actually based in Washington, but we have terrific coffee here. That coffee is made by a friend of mine named Mujer. Mujer was a Sudanese refugee who had to flee his country due to the war. He lost his father, and Mujer ended up in southern Ethiopia in a camp where he spent much of his youth. But he sort of won the lottery and was given a chance to resettle to the United States. But many of his family and many of his friends and community are still there. They're still in southern Ethiopia. Mujer came here to Richmond, not far from where I am now, attended school at the University of Richmond through scholarship, and then he started a social enterprise. So his company is called 734 Coffee. I highly recommend tasting his coffee, buying his coffee. You may even consider investing in his work. That coffee, the revenue that he generates, the profits from his coffee, go back into supporting two things. One, providing education for children in the camp that he came from, so that there isn't a lost generation. People today can spend up to 26 years displaced, which is very different from the environment that people were displaced in post-World War II, which was usually around 5 years, meaning you'd either go home or you get resettled somewhere else in that time frame. 26 years is a lifetime. And we know many people who have grown up, who have gotten married, who have had children, and never left camp settings. That's really only about 20%, 30% of those who are displaced are still in those environments. Many are trapped in some sort of limbo in urban or peri-urban settings. But back to Mujer. So part of the funds go to support child education. The others go back to support coffee growers who are displaced and are building economic opportunities for themselves. As he will be the first to say, anyone, he's not looking for a handout, nor the people and community that he works. They want a chance, and they don't want to be stuck in this cycle of aid dependency. And wherever you go in the world and you find displaced people, whether they are resettled here and are part of the American fabric or are overseas, you will find them to be the most resilient, generous contributors of anyone that I certainly have met. And he's doing this now, employing people, providing financing for smallholder farmers in Ethiopia, and providing education for those who otherwise wouldn't have access to it. And for investors, it's a chance to make some money while doing it. I think he's a great story, and he's, you know, sub-Series A, so he's post-seed and growing.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. Thank you so much. And we're cutting I do want to leave some time for Q&A in the breakout session. So I'm going to ask each of you very briefly, 3 sentences or less. What is it that you need? How can people engage? And then we'll give time in the Q&A, I'm sorry, in the breakout sessions for each of you developing that further within your groups. So, Emma.
Sure. So I think what we see is just that there continues to be a huge need for refugee-lens investing and for financing refugee communities and impacted host communities and those, you know, dealing with forcible migration. So it's really important for us to continue the work. With COVID, obviously things have, you know, it's impacted vulnerable communities even more, and a lot of refugees fall into that very vulnerable group in fragile communities. So for us, it's really, you know, we have kiva.org where you can lend through the crowdfunding platform. I'll put a link to our website where we have just information about what we've been doing related to refugees. I'll put it in the chat. And I think also, you know, we're looking to scale through Kiva Refugee Investment Fund, looking for, you know, kind of finalizing that and closing it soon, we hope. So it's about a $30 million private credit vehicle. So working with investors to kind of get that across the finish line now. I think one thing we also see is we're, you know, hoping to do some more work on the impact. So that's really important for us, for Kiva as an impact first, you know, company through and through. So it's really, you know, we've been looking for different ways that we can really push the conversation related to the information we're gathering on impact for refugee-lens investing. So that would be through grant funding and that type of thing.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yanki. Okay. 3 seconds, 3 sentences or less if you can.
Oh my God, what a challenge. So, you know, I was actually going to share 2 slides of, you know, 2 of our clients, and, you know, it gives you a sense of, you know, anyway, I guess we don't have the time. So yes, we're looking for investments. We want people to be more aware of, you know, it's just, you know, they're not a, you know, whole group immigrants. There's, you know, refugees have a slightly different story. And, you know, as you heard the story of people staying in camps for many, many years, to be supportive of refugee resettlement. So BCNA, so if you want to do something immediately today, one thing we did during the COVID crisis is, you know, we had 3 groups of clients. One that was really, you know, actually doing quite well, all the grocery stores and certain, you know, some specific businesses. And then there were one that had some savings, but there was one group, and these were refugee clients primarily from various African countries who are street vendors, hair braiders. So they were really suffering. So we have started a GoFundMe campaign. So if you want to do something immediately, very happy for you to go, and we can share the link, contribute. But long term, it's about diversifying our investments and, you know, spreading the word about refugee entrepreneurship.
Great, thanks. John, and then we're going to go to Q&A. So get your questions ready.
Sorry, I was just responding to a question. So I think a couple of things. One, very simply, for those who are active investors, either as accredited individual investors or as institutional or foundations, commit to doing your first Refugee-Lens deal in the next 12 months. And if you are interested in having support or advisory services to help you enable that, to help you find that pipeline, to figure out what's the right fit given your existing portfolio, we're here to help. That's exactly why we exist, is to enable that capital mobilization so that it gets to the people that are seeking that capital. And 2 is to, you know, consider supporting organizations that are working to build the field. It might not be in the context of investment, but is in the context of enabling investment. This is an emerging field. The RIN isn't the only intermediary we cannot be, but intermediaries themselves do need to be supported, particularly to do the public goods part of the work, which is really about education. It's about providing market-based research that enables deal flow, enables improvements in policies that can create those investment opportunities.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so we're officially opening it up for questions, and we already have one come in that from Jeannie. I'm curious about your thoughts on how many of these investments would be made with or without the lens. Do you, John?
So I'll just take a quick stab, and then maybe Yanki or Emma wants to jump in. You know, if you look at gender lens investing, this is still a field that needs to grow, but there have been people working on this for well over a decade, 15, 20 years now. And still, the percentage of dollars from venture capital that is going to women-led, women majority managed businesses is infinitesimal to those who are male-led businesses. That is not because there is a deficiency in the deal pipeline of women-led companies. That is because there is a lack of intentional practice to invest them that counterbalances the biases that are held by most of the holders of capital, which typically are white men. So that is why these lenses are really important, because it forces that intentionality in the practice. It doesn't guarantee it, but at least it becomes something that is part of the practice. So I think about the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, now the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. That institution, that agency working on behalf of U.S. taxpayers to conduct economic development overseas, invest with U.S. interests and with U.S. capital, now has this Gender 2X initiative, and they are actually, you know, seeing a real uptick in the number of deals that they're participating in actively and deploying capital in. That wouldn't happen if there wasn't that intentionality behind it, and the specific questions relating to that baked into the process of how they do their work. And that's really what we're trying to do, is normalize this, make this something that is a practice for you and not an accident. We have plenty of historical refugee lens deals that we can point to that were coincidental. You know, I think about Sundial Brands, which Bain Capital, not Bain Double Impact, but Bain Capital invested in a few years ago. And then Sundial was sold afterwards to Unilever. And, you know, well, I'll just say Bain did very well, but they didn't do that while Sundial was led by two former refugees from Liberia. They weren't using a refugee lens, but they could have gotten in much earlier if they were. And I think that's the opportunity here for investors that are adapting this lens, is you're going to have another advantage to find what we call the immigrant alpha, and to bake that into the deals that you're working on.
Fantastic. To what extent are refugee businesses creating jobs or refugees for both refugees and non-refugees?
So this is based on what I know from the data we have from, you know, our own internal data and data from, my dog is, sorry. Yeah. You know, data from the 21 organizations we work with at any given point. The majority of the refugee businesses tend to hire from the refugee community. And they would say on average, each business creates 1.5 jobs.
And on our side, I would say that's very much a focus of the partners that we work with, is, you know, making loans to entrepreneurs. So that's extremely important, is the underwriting that those institutions are doing of those small businesses, and, you know, the impact they have on the community by hiring others. So that's really crucial.
And I would just say, you know, if you think about the full market, just in the United States, you've got over 3,000 refugee entrepreneurs who are running small and medium-sized businesses. That's not counting the micro side of things. And then you think about statistics that aren't necessarily specific to refugees, but certainly include them. So the fact that 44% of the Fortune 500 companies were founded by refugees, immigrants, or their children, I think gives you a sense of the scale. Sundial Brands, which I mentioned, employs over 4,000 women in Liberia, many of whom were displaced at one point by the Civil War. So that's just, to give you a sense, there is a broad spectrum depending on the deal. But as Yanki mentioned, many of the earlier stage companies or the smaller micro ventures are employing a smaller pool of people.
Also, there are a lot of very innovative companies like Natakalam, where they hire refugees in camps and they teach languages via Skype. So it'd be nice to see more investments in companies like that.
So we have a few more questions yet, and I do want to save some time for the breakout. We're going to take one respondent per question. So on average, how long does it take for investors to see ROI? And I know that it depends on the investment, but perhaps, John, since you're having a broader perspective, maybe would you care to take this one?
I think, Diana, you hit the nail on the head. It depends on the deal. I mean, this is like, what's the average flying speed of a South African swallow? It really, it's a question that, what is the return? I would say, what's the return that you're looking for? And then let's find you the right deals that match that expectation. So CEO, the IRC CDFI I mentioned, is providing those returns on a 2 to 5 year basis right now. That's a low yield return that they're offering. It'd be more akin to perhaps a savings opportunity, but will certainly outperform savings given the way that interest rates are going right now. But there are others that are more in line with traditional venture opportunities. So Data Miner is a company. It's not led by refugees, but it is improving humanitarian response capacities and innovation. They particularly focus on providing real-time data and analytics to big institutions like the Department of Defense. But they received a venture investment from Humanitarian Ventures. Because of that investment, they started looking at how they could use the same satellite GIS and data analytic technology to improve real-time data access for organizations like Mercy Corps, which are doing life-saving work evacuating people out of very dangerous places like Libya. But traditionally, humanitarian actors have access to very poor data, typically 2 weeks old on average. So being able to have Data Miner as a data provider and accessing their services, which were enabled because of direct investment, was totally transformative for their field evacuations. That opportunity is a traditional VC deal, and I would expect Humanitarian Ventures to recoup principal plus interest within the next 3 to 5 years.
Fantastic.
We provide 2 to 3% on investments.
Perfect. Well, thank you. So to allow a few minutes for the breakout and to end on time, I know everyone's got been on Zoom quite a bit the past several months. We will then break out into several groups. You should have in your chat that you'll have the prompts to exit and join a new group.
I'd like to add my thanks to all the speakers. It reminds me just how well established the field is, yet how relatively undercovered it is given the gravity of the situation for many refugees. And as John mentioned, my takeaway here is that there's such an opportunity risk-reward spectrum that there's opportunities for everyone to get involved. In terms of the breakouts, yes.
I do want to just thank you all. Thank you to the Impact Capital Forum for making this discussion possible. Thank you to each of the discussants and experts here. I've learned so much from you. I'm super grateful. And to the audience for your time. Looking forward to the breakout. Please engage. However you can collaborate to move the needle, we welcome your support. Thanks.
And as for the breakouts, we'll be starting in just a minute. This is an optional additional session. It's about 20 minutes. We'll give time. I imagine we'll have 3 or 4, well, probably 4 groups of 5 to 8 people. And again, an opportunity for you to ask another question, share a project you work on, try to get involved. You will see in the chat bar the login. Again, because Zoom differentiates webinars from interactive meetings, you have to quit this meeting, then say join, and then enter the meeting number, which is in chat. It's 828-2182-7606. And the password is 551911. Now for the audience, you have a registration email from us. It's in there as well. But just like any good advertisement, which this is not, I will repeat it one more time and then we'll shift. 828-2182-7606. And the password is 551911. Thanks for everyone for joining this portion of the event and for the speakers, and we'll see you on the other side.